Now, if you're taking care of these bearings, when you pressure wash and you grease them every time afterwards, these bearings are going to last you quite a while. But if you forget, you pressure wash this machine and you get a little bit of water into the bearings, first thing that's going to happen is they're going to rust. As soon as they rust, they're going to go. Bearings, I've had friends that have had them in their machines for years, no problems. But here's what we're going to do to show you how to replace them. It's not that hard, not that expensive. First thing we're going to do, this is a dirty machine, so we're showing you what it looks like. So we're going to take a pressure washer with hot water, and we're going to clean this up. It's always better to work on a clean machine, guys. Take the time to pressure wash and clean up your machine before you have to take it apart and work on it, and you're going to be a lot happier when you go to put it back together. So since we're replacing these bearings, we're going ahead and blasting pretty hard all around the bearing and the snap rings so that we can make this much easier on ourselves to take this apart, because if the machine's old or it's been run hot, sometimes this can be a little bit of a problem to get these bearings out. So the cleaner that you get this machine before you start, the easier working on it's going to be. Get yourself that pressure washer with that hot water, guys. It'll make a big difference. Once we've got it clean, we're going to put it in the best working position for taking this thing apart. And as you can see, that is with it on its side. I always find it easier to do it like this. First thing, take the belt off. Real easy to do. If it's too easy, it means that if you've got one of these green or red belts, you need to take a link out, so when you put it back together, it's tight. If you've got a black belt, then it should be just fine. We're going to remove the set screws, or just take them and loosen them up on the reel. And if it pulls off tight, if you haven't had it never seized properly when you put it back together, you may have to find a way to pry it off or get a little pulley to get it off. It doesn't happen very often. Don't forget that there's a key stock in here that you don't want to lose either. Now you're going to loosen the two set screws on the bearing. You don't have to take them all the way out, just loosen them. So now we're just going to set the machine back up real quick so that we can pull the motor out. This is very easy. There are 4 Allen head bolts that hold the electrical switch in place. You remove all 4 of those, and then it's free and just connected just by the cord that goes to the electric motor. Then there are 4 large Allen head bolts that hold the motor in place. These, if you'll loosen the 3 bottom ones, the lower ones, and leave the top one in place till the last one, it makes it easier to take this motor out. So I go ahead and break them all, and then once I break them, you go ahead and remove the lower 3 ones. Then you can slip your hand underneath the motor and help support it a little bit. Or if you're not that strong, put a couple of 2x4s underneath it so it doesn't drop when you pull this last bolt out. The motor has a slight flange that fits into that big hole, so it kind of supports it as long as you're pushing towards the thing and lifting up. Once you get this bolt out, though, all the weight of that motor is going to be on your hand. So grab the pulley on the front and just guide it in and let it sit back down on the countertop that you're working on. Now what's going to happen with some of these older machines is that they're going to be seized up a little bit. The bearings, especially if they've been burnt real bad. So it's always a good idea to put a little WD-40 or some sort of a braking fluid, like the fluid film that you would use on the 2.0 or anything like that. Turn the machine up on its end and spray into the area around the bearing and the shaft, and this will allow it to seep down in and help to break and loosen it up. Turn it over and do the other side, same thing. This is going to make a lot of difference in pulling this thing off, especially if it's been heated up or left real dirty. Now we're going to go ahead and just take apart the other things that we don't need on the machine so that we can press the bearings in. So that's the adjustment blocks that you just saw will come off on both sides. We've got the machine back on its side, which is the easiest way to do this. And we're going to remove these cross members that go between the cheek plates. The first thing is to take one cheek plate off. So we're going to remove all of these Allen head bolts that hold these cross members into position. So that's 12 bolts, 3 on each corner. a weighted mallet, those polyurethane mallets, is absolutely the best thing to have so you don't scar up your finish. When you start tapping on this, tap in different areas from behind and try and stay as close to the reel or bearing as you can get. Do not tap super hard. We managed to get this off pretty easily. Sometimes it's a lot harder than this, and the only thing I can say is if you run into a problem where it's stuck, give me a call. So we pull that cheek plate off. Then we're going to take the shrouds out. And they're easy. They just come right out. There's only 2 tabs on each side on both the upper and lower shroud. But get them out of your way right now. And then we're going to take this reel out. Now you can see how old this reel looks. It's actually looking pretty rough. This machine has been used pretty hard. But it's still pretty sharp. And also at this point, when you get it out, if you give me a call, I'll run you through how to sharpen those up just a little bit with a whetstone. So now we're going to take the cross members off of the other cheek plate. And remember, when you get to that last bolt, hold the cross members so that you're not stressing the bolt or cracking anything. You'll take all 4 of these off. And that's going to free up our last cheek plate. And then we're going to be able to press these bearings out of it. So once we've removed all of the excess items from this second cheek plate, we refer to these as, this is the motor side cheek plate. The other one is non-motor side cheek plate. Just in case we're talking and you want to know what I'm talking about, that's what you'll be hearing. Now these bearings, they're going to probably still be a little dirty even though you pressure washed them. And we have a big snap ring on the other side of this that we're going to want to take off. So you need a good pair of snap ring pliers. If you go buy yourself a cheap pair of snap ring pliers, this is going to irritate you to death. If you buy a good pair that have the ratchet type set up on them, you're going to be a lot happier with getting this apart. Holding that rag over it will keep it from popping up and hitting you in the eye. Pressing out the bearing is just easier on the cheek plates and easier on everything. You can tap them out with that same rubber mallet, but you got to be really careful that you don't break something when you're doing this. So when you press things out, it's a smoother, easier motion, and you have much less chance of injuring anything. Now when you go to put these bearings back in, you can't tap these bearings back in. That will damage a new set of bearings. So you've got to come up with some way of pressing these bearings back in. We're going to press these bearings out. Now if you got somebody with a little small press, that's great. If not, and you just absolutely can't find a press, you're going to have to give me a call and I'll try to help you get it out in other ways. We've got this little small cheap press that we made a couple of aluminum pieces for that fit over the bearings properly and allow us to press bearings in and out. It's really handy. It's not very expensive. If you don't have a friend that works on vehicles or a machine shop near you, you can pick one of these up at any of the parts or tool supply places for probably about $50-$60. So when we go to replace these bearings, we want to be careful that we orient them, put them in the right direction. So as you can see, we've got these cheek plates bookend. So where the knife and the bed bar go are on opposite sides facing each other. The bearing has to go in a specific way. There are little small holes in the bearing that you can see that you want them facing directly 90 degrees to that bed knife so that we can grease these bearings later on. So just look at where we're orienting that hole. There's 2 of them in each bearing surface in the slot. Make sure it's facing the direction you see this going in. Stick it in, line it up so it's somewhat into the hole but not very hard. Leave that opening on the snap ring facing down in this direction. That'll keep you from blasting water into it when you're washing this machine, because there's also grease relief holes underneath that snap ring. Once you get it back into position, we're going to take it up. You can see where that hole for the grease bearing is lined up, heading out directly 90 degrees. We've got a little aluminum head fitting that fits very nicely over the top of the bearings. You might have to push your set screws in a little bit to make sure that they're not sticking out too far. But you can see that it rests on the outside race of the bearing, and this is where you want to press a bearing in from. You don't want to press it in from the center. You'll damage the bearings. So these aren't too expensive a thing to have made, and if you're going to be doing a lot of work with your machine, it's probably a good idea to get one. You may replace your bearings once a year, less if you grease them really well. Put your cheek plate up there nice and flush. Make sure that your aluminum or whatever material it's made of seats over the bearing properly, and it shouldn't take very much pressure at all to press it down into position. The reason we're pressing it is so that if we were trying to tap it in with a hammer, you could put a little tiny flat on one of the ball bearings just by the concussion, and then it's going to go bad. Once you've got both of these bearings pressed in properly, it's time to put the snap ring in place. Now this snap ring has to go in so that the open side of it allows that hole where you're going to be greasing this to be exposed. So you put your snap ring pliers on these, and you're going to expand this ring, and then you're going to push down on it so it seats in this little groove. But do you see the hole? That hole has to be right between these snap rings, because when you put the snap ring on, it's going to open that up a little wider, and you have to make sure these snap rings are seated. If you don't get these snap rings perfectly seated into that groove, then this bearing is going to come out. That won't be good. And look once again to make sure that your hole's exposed and facing 90 degrees so that you're going to have access to grease these bearings. Here you can see the hole's just a little out of center. So he's going to tap it. This is a check to make sure it's in its groove properly, but it also gives him an opportunity to make sure that it's centered. The hole is nice and centered between the open part of the snap rings. We like to add a little bit more grease to these at this stage. It's nice and easy. It gives you an opportunity to put the grease needle in. Use a high temperature lithium grease. This kit comes with the tool, and you can see that there's a little bit of moisture in these bearings already. So as we're squeezing this grease in, what it does mainly is it pushes any excess water or moisture out of the bearings, and this is really important. It also adds fresh grease to the bearings. As you squeeze a little bit, rotate the bearing by hand, and you should be able to get grease all the way around it. Remember, every time you pressure wash this machine, you're going to want to do this, and you want to do it right away. You don't want to wait till the next day. Remember, the main goal of greasing these bearings in this machine is to displace any moisture or water that gets inside of them. They're called seal bearings, but there's no such thing as a totally sealed bearing. Once you start seeing the grease come out, you've done your job. Go back with a rag, however, and clean this excess grease up before you start putting this machine together. So I'm going to show you a way to put the bearings in that I don't like. I hope you don't do it. But if you're in an emergency situation, you have to replace your bearings and you don't have a press, here's the only good way of doing it. Put the cheek plate up onto a couple of 2x4s so that you leave space below it. Orient your bearing just as you would orient your bearing in the other portions if you were going to put it in with a press. Make sure that your opening on your snap ring is facing down. Make sure that you've got your cheek plate in the right position, and you've got the right cheek plate and the bearing going in. You can put these bearings in backwards real easy. Now we've taken our fitting. You can use a socket head. You can use almost anything that you can put over the bearing that will put the pressure on the outside of the bearing race. And use your mallet and just tap this thing. The trick is to tap it back in squarely, to tap it in so that it is not getting cocked. If you start seeing this bearing get cocked to one side, stop, take the bearing back out and start again. You'll have to apply too much pressure to drive it in that way. Light taps, not a big tap. By putting something over the bearing like this, you have a very good chance of putting the bearing in without damage in it. I just don't like to see it done this way. So now we're going to start reassembling the machine. We're going to start out by doing that by removing the reel end adapters. These are the two stainless steel parts on either end of the reel. One's a female thread, one's a male thread. And we're going to go ahead and take those off and show you how to just clean them up, how to lubricate them and put them back on. So the only reason you'd ever have to take these off is if you've damaged one in some manner, or you've decided to purchase a new reel and start out with a fresh reel. So you'd take these off and put them back on the new reel. But a little trick to getting the drive side off is go ahead and put your little keystock back in, put your pulley back on, get yourself a rag or wear good rubber gloves and hold on to that blade. Remember, that reel is sharp. So by putting the pulley back on, you give yourself a bit of a traction to be able to unscrew this. And it should come off pretty easy. We're pretty careful when we put them together to have never sees on them. Once you get it off, you get a chance to clean up those threads real good. Wire brush, rag with a little alcohol or something. Make sure they're all cleaned up. I like to get an air hose and blow out the threads on the inside of the reel too. Same thing pretty much with the non-drive side. Now, there's not really an easy way to get it, so make sure you put a good rag, a terry cloth rag or something thick and hard over it. Get yourself a pair of channel locks and grab it. You don't want to scar this thing up. But this right here should give you enough leverage to get it loose. Again, we put never sees on every single one, so unless you've had this apart and not done that when you reassembled it, it shouldn't be too hard to take off. Now once you get this off, it's the reverse. The male threads are on the reel and the female threads are inside the end, but you still would like to clean this up. Wire brush the whole thing down real good. And if you've got a little air pressure or parts cleaner or anything else, you can put the extension into it and clean it up real good too. So now we're going to reinstall it. We're just going to do it on the same reel so you can see how it's done. So we put some never sees on first. We also take some Loctite, and you can see the type Loctite here in the video. We just put a little bit on it too. This is to keep it from vibrating loose. And take it down as far as you can by hand. A little never sees on the shaft, spread it around a little bit, will make it go back into the new bearings a lot easier and keeping it from corroding at a later time when you got to pull it apart. This is a real important part. Don't miss this. And you should try not to get the never sees on the groove. That's a drive groove. You want to keep it dry. And you want to keep it from having oil or grease on it. Now once you put this machine back together, you're probably going to go over that and clean it up with a rag and some alcohol anyway to make sure it's clean. But just try to keep it clear. Now we go to the other side, exactly the same thing. Never sees. A little bit of Loctite. Put the piece back on. And then a little bit of never sees on it, and we're ready to drop this reel back in between the cheek plates. Put the cross members back on to the cheek plates. So when you're orienting these cross members, remember that the larger casters, this is an older machine, so it has an older style caster on it, but it's still 3 inches. So the larger casters go on the motor side cheek plate. So make sure you have the motor side cheek plate in the right position. Make sure that the bearings with the set screws are facing out, and that's how this thing goes back together again. So get the first cross member on one side down on the bottom, and then your other cross member, make sure that you have your threaded holes facing up so that you can attach your upper module to it. And just get all of these bolts in place, and you don't have to tighten them all the way yet. In fact, it's important that you don't. We just want them tightened down where we're lightly compressing the lock washers. A trick to doing these are to turn the bolts backwards a little bit until you feel it click. This stops you from cross-threading these bolts into the aluminum. So as you can see when he's doing this, he gives it a quick little backspin, and then you'll feel it actually click, and then you go forward and they'll go in quite easily. Sometimes if you just try to drive them in, you may have a little cross thread on them, so it feels hard. And if you're doing that, you're stripping your thread. So stop, back it off, and start again. Once you've got the motor side cheek plate on, I find it a little easier to spin it around. Now remember, the non-drive side goes to the side of the machine where you don't have a cheek plate yet. The drive side, that's the side with the shaft, the longer shaft, goes into the bearing that you have on the motor side. There's no way to put the reel in wrong if you do it this way. Slide it in. Hopefully the never seats has made it nice and easy to go in. And you want to make sure that it's all the way to the shoulder. So push it all the way. You can see the little space between the bearing and the shoulder of the reel. Now the tricky part. Let's get these shrouds back in position. There's 2 tabs on each shroud. And the trick to putting these shrouds in is to get them started. Get the big one in position first and get it up into its slots a little bit. This is just a little hammer we stick underneath to keep it setting up. So now we're getting ready to put the other cheek plate in position. Remember that the set screws go out. Now, when you get that shroud in its 2 slots on the other side, on the other cheek plate, you kind of hold it in position and start tapping your cheek plate back in until it's just flush with those other 2 tabs. Now by moving them around, you're going to get them to where they'll go into the 2 tabs on this other cheek plate. But you don't want to go all the way. You just want to get them just started. So you're leaving the cheek plate not all the way pressed in. The reason for this is you're about to try and get the other cheek plate in. So get it just started. You may have to tap it a few times to get it where it's just perfect. Push it all the way to one side and then get it to where you just can put it in. You still have a movement between the 2 of them. Now you can take your upper shroud and put it in at an angle from this position. Pull it over and get the other 2 ones to just go in a little bit. Now once you get all of them just a little bit in, now you can tap that cheek plate in position and the shrouds will be where they're supposed to be. Now remember, we want to tap this cheek plate until its inside bearing race is flush with the shoulder of the reel. Once you get that done, we can start putting all of the screws in to hold the upper and lower cross members in place. Here's what we do with every single screw. You should always have some never sees. So just take a little tiny bit of never sees and put it on before you put the bolt back in. If you'll do this every time you assemble or reassemble, you're going to have a much easier job of working on your machine. So once you've got these bolts at least somewhat tight, we don't want them real tight. Now we're going to try and square these things up. This is an important part of making this machine nice and true. So take your fingers and go around over the outside edges and feel where they line up with the cheek plate. All you're trying to do is get it flush. Sometimes it's a little bit of a tap here, a little bit of a tap there. And again, all you're trying to do is flush the edges up with the cheek plate as best you can. You can never make it perfect, but you can always take out any little extra slop there might be, and this will make your machine run truer. So get them squared up. As you square them up, as you get them squared up, I like to see the bolts tightened. So you can go around and try to square everything up first, but as you get it true, each corner, go ahead and tighten those 3 bolts as you square it up so that they stay that way. Because if you keep tapping on one side and then go over to the other side and tap before you tighten the bolts, you'll just simply move the side you just took care of. So once you've got it all tightened up, the final thing here is to make sure that you tighten up the reel end extensions. Now on the one that's on the non-drive side, the best you can do is put a set of rubber gloves on, hold the reel, and tighten it up by hand. As soon as you get this done, tighten your set screws into position. And a little back and forth on set screws is always a good idea. In other words, don't tighten one all by itself as tight as you can. Tighten them both lightly, then go back and retighten the other one before. This helps keep the shaft on center. Now on the drive side for this pulley, we can get a little bit tighter. We put the pulley back on along with the key stock in it. We take a piece of wood and jam it in between the reel so that the reel won't turn. And now we can use the pulley to really tighten up that extension so that it's all the way into the threads. Once we get that in real nice and tight, same thing. Tighten your set screws. Tighten one first a little bit, go back and tighten the other one a little bit, and then duplicate that to finish tightening up as much as you can. And don't tighten up the pulley yet, because we've still got adjustments to do on that. Now you can put your blade adjustment assemblies back in place. This is, of course, real simple. You should have done this already by now. This is a heavy motor, so it's a real good idea to put your brakes on your casters. If you got a newer model, you've got brakes all the way around. If you have an older model, you only have brakes on the back, but set them down nice and tight so this thing doesn't roll around with you. Put it in as you see. Look at the orientation we have it in so that the cord that goes to the switch is wrapped over the top. That's important. Your square box should be facing forward, your capacitor round on top. Now once you get it in, that little flange will kind of rest in the hole and you'll be able to hold it in place. Start your top bolt first. As you start to try and thread that in, you're going to have to wiggle it a little bit sometime to get it in. And also remember, put some never sees on these bolts before you put them in. All bolts, a little bit of never sees. Don't forget your washers on them too. Once you get the top bolt almost all the way in by hand, then you can get the rest of them started and take them all down. As usual, we like to tighten in sequence. We don't like to tighten one and then all the way. So tighten them all down to where they're somewhat snug and then go back around and tighten them up the rest of the way. Now we mount our switch. 4 bolts. A little bit of wiggling around with the switch in your hand will help you locate those bolts. A little bit of never sees on the bolts. And get them all started. First, get them all started. Don't tighten one first. Get them all started, and then you come back and retighten them. The pulley up on top on the reel, sometimes you'll have to readjust that once you put a drum in place because you're going to want to get it so that it's just next to that drum pulley. But usually we can, since we haven't moved the pulley on the bottom, we didn't take it off on the motor, we can use it as an indicator of where the top pulley should be. So you take a ruler just like you see, press it against the surface of the lower pulley, and line the upper outer surface of the upper pulley with that. Once you get those two parallel with each other, then you can go and tighten your set screws on that upper pulley. And this is going to probably put you right back where you should be. Later we'll go over a little bit of how to line that up even more perfect. When you put your belt back on, if you've got the high-speed machine with the green belt on it, you want to make sure that there's some little holes in it. They look like arrows. They go counterclockwise to the way the machine turns.